There was a moment, standing behind a counter I had run for over a decade, when a man looked straight at me and asked if there was someone more qualified he could speak with. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say anything that would shock you if you read it out of context. He was perfectly polite in the way that certain people are perfectly polite. The kind of polite that still manages to make you feel like you are standing in a room you weren't supposed to be allowed into. And I stood there, in my apron, with 11 years of work behind me and everything I had built around me, and I made a choice about how to respond. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he had already decided not to find out, was that the two of us were connected by something that went far beyond that counter. Something that had happened 14 months earlier, 2 blocks away, on a Wednesday afternoon, when a family packed everything they owned into a moving truck while people stood on the sidewalk not knowing what to say. I was one of those people on the sidewalk, and the man standing in front of me asking for someone more qualified was the reason that truck was there. What happened over the next 4 days is not the story I expected to live. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic confrontation where someone finally gets what they deserve. It is about something quieter and harder and more permanent than any of that. Stay with me. Because the part that changed everything is not the part you are expecting. I remember the exact moment I stopped apologizing for who I am. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that starts quiet, almost forgettable. The sort of day you'd never expect to mark the rest of your life. The coffee shop was still half empty when I opened. I'd been the first one in, like always, pulling up the metal shutters while the sky was still that deep, bruised blue before sunrise. My hands smelled like espresso grounds before 7 in the morning. That was my life, and for a long time, I had convinced myself it was enough. My name is Vimala. I'm 38 years old. I was born in New Jersey, raised between 2 worlds, the one outside our door, and the one my parents brought with them from a small town in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. My mother came to this country with $80 and a suitcase held shut with a piece of rope. My father came with a degree nobody here recognized, so he went back to school at night and drove a taxi during the day. They built something from nothing, and they never once asked anyone to applaud them for it. I used to tell people I managed the coffee shop. That was technically true. But what I did was more than manage. I knew every regular by name, by order, by mood. I knew when Maureen from the 4th floor had a hard night because she always asked for an extra shot on those mornings. I knew that David, the contractor who came in before his crew, liked his coffee with exactly 1 sugar and would pretend he didn't when his co-workers were around. I knew people. That was my real skill. The shop sat at the corner of a street that had changed a lot in the past few years. What used to be a neighborhood with a hardware store and a dry cleaner had slowly become something shinier. New buildings, glass lobbies, the kind of place where people paid $4,000 a month for an apartment and then complained about the noise. Our coffee shop had survived the change mostly because we were good and because people need their routines. I had started working there 11 years earlier, when I was still figuring out what my life was supposed to look like. I dropped out of a master's program, not because I failed, but because my father had a heart attack and someone had to keep things together at home. I told myself it was temporary. 11 years is a strange definition of temporary, but I had stopped fighting that word a long time ago. The morning everything changed, I was behind the counter training a new hire named Jess. She was 22, nervous, kept knocking her elbow into the steam wand. I liked her immediately. She reminded me of myself at that age, eager in a way that the world hadn't had time to wear down yet. I was showing her how to texture oat milk without scalding it when the door opened. He walked in, the way certain men do, not looking around to take in the space, but expecting the space to rearrange itself around him. He was somewhere in his 50s, wearing the kind of suit that signals money without announcing it. Silver hair, trimmed close, a watch that probably cost more than my car. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and had the unhurried posture of someone who has never once worried about being late because everyone waits for him. I noticed all of this in the first few seconds, not because I was judging. I'd learned long ago that appearances were almost always incomplete stories, but because after 11 years of reading people across a counter, it becomes reflexive. You see the whole person before they even open their mouth. He didn't look at Jess. He didn't look at the menu board, though he stood below it long enough that he clearly could have. He looked at me, And then, in the slow, deliberate way of someone who has decided something before a single word has been exchanged, he looked away. He walked to the far end of the counter. There was no line. He could have stood anywhere. He chose the spot farthest from where I was standing and waited. I finished what I was showing Jess, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked over. "Good morning," I said. "What can I get started for you?" He glanced at me the way you might glance at a door that someone else is supposed to be opening. "Is there a manager here?" he asked. I have been asked that question before. In this job, in other jobs, in rooms where I was the most qualified person present. The question always carries the same weight beneath it, the same unspoken implication. I have learned to hear what's behind it without flinching. "I'm the manager," I said. "I'm also happy to take your order." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like minor inconvenience. He set the portfolio on the counter, not gently, and pulled out a business card, sliding it toward me. I didn't look at it right away. I kept my eyes on him. "I'm hosting a private event next Saturday," he said. 30 people. I'll need catering, coffee service, pastries, the whole thing. I assumed someone with more experience handles that kind of inquiry. There it was, dressed up in perfectly neutral language, but unmistakable if you knew how to listen. "I handle all of our catering inquiries," I said. "I've coordinated events for up to 200 guests. I'd be glad to talk through what you need." He picked up the business card and turned it slowly between his fingers, like he was considering whether to offer it again or put it back in his pocket. "Do you have someone I can speak with? Someone who's done this sort of thing before?" By this point, Jess had gone very still behind me. She was pretending to restock cups. A woman at the corner table who had been reading something on her laptop had looked up. The moment had taken on that specific quiet that happens when people in a shared space sense something uncomfortable unfolding. I looked at him steadily, not coldly, not with the brittle performance of someone swallowing their dignity. I looked at him the way my mother used to look at people who underestimated her, with a patience so complete it was almost a gift. "I'm the person you're looking for," I said. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he smiled, a small, private smile, the kind that has nothing to do with warmth, and he placed the business card back on the counter. "We'll see," he said. And then he ordered a black coffee, which Jess made while her hands trembled slightly, and he took it to the corner table without another word. He sat down, opened his portfolio, and began to make calls. I went back to training Jess. I kept my voice even. I showed her how to check the grind size. I answered her questions. But something had settled in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something older and quieter than anger. Something that had been growing in me for years, shaped by every room I'd walked into, where someone had already decided who I was before I'd had the chance to introduce myself. I looked at the business card he'd left on the counter. I picked it up. I read the name. And then I understood, though I didn't know it yet, that this man had just made the most expensive mistake of his week. He stayed at that corner table for almost 40 minutes. I know because I kept track without meaning to. The way you track something that hasn't resolved itself yet. A conversation left open. A door left slightly ajar. He made 3 phone calls, spoke in the low, controlled voice of someone accustomed to being listened to, and never once looked up at the counter. He drank his coffee without commenting on it, which, from certain people, is the closest thing to a compliment you'll receive. Jess leaned toward me during a quiet moment between customers. "Who is he?" she whispered. "I don't know yet," I said. That was still true. I had read the name on the card, Harkirat Segal, but names alone don't tell you much. I had worked long enough in this city to know that names attached to a certain kind of confidence usually came with a story, and the story was usually about money, and money in this city came in many shapes. Some of those shapes were genuinely impressive. Some were inherited. Some were simply loud. What I did know, from the card, was that he was in real estate development. Senior partner at a firm whose name I recognized from the new construction 2 blocks north, a mixed-use building that had displaced a laundromat and a family-owned pharmacy to make room for luxury condominiums and a rooftop terrace. I had watched that building go up over 18 months. I had watched the family that ran the pharmacy pack their things into a moving truck on a Wednesday afternoon, while their regular customers stood on the sidewalk not knowing what to say. I'm not telling you this to cast him as a villain from the first sentence. Life is more complicated than that, And I've never trusted stories where the bad person is simply bad, stamped that way from the beginning like a label on a jar. What I'm telling you is context. The kind of context that matters when you're trying to understand how someone moves through the world, what they've been told they're allowed to take, and what they've come to believe about the people who have less than they do. He came back to the counter just before 10. The shop had filled up by then. The morning rush had its own rhythm. The commuters gone, the remote workers settling in, the mothers with strollers claiming the wider tables near the window. There was a comfortable noise to it, the kind I had spent years learning to work inside without losing my own thoughts. He waited. This time, he stood at the center of the counter, which meant I was the natural person to approach him. I walked over. "I thought more about the event," he said. No greeting. As if our earlier conversation had simply been paused and was now resuming. 30 guests, Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. My firm's office space, 2 floors up. He gestured vaguely upward, which I took to mean one of the new buildings nearby. "I'll need someone professional managing the service." "Of course," I said. "I can put together a proposal for you. If you give me a few details about the format, whether it's a seated dinner, a standing reception, the dietary requirements of your guests, I can have something to you by end of day." He paused. "Have you done this for corporate clients before?" "Yes," I said, "regularly." "Large firms? Not just neighborhood things?" There was a particular texture to that phrase. Neighborhood things, said in a tone that made the neighborhood sound like something charming and small, the kind of place you might visit on a Sunday, but wouldn't trust with anything important. "We've catered for law firms, medical conferences, a film production company, and a series of private fundraising events over the past 4 years," I said. "I can share references if that would help." He looked at me with an expression I had seen before. Not quite disbelief, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of someone recalibrating without wanting to show they're doing it. "Your references would be from here? From this shop?" "From our catering division, yes, which I built and run." A man waiting behind him shifted his weight. A woman 2 seats down at the counter had stopped looking at her phone. The room wasn't listening the way it had been before. It was listening in that more deliberate way, the way people listen when they sense something worth paying attention to. Harkirat Sehgal set both hands on the counter. It was a gesture I recognized, the gesture of someone who is about to say something they've already decided to say and are simply choosing their moment. "Look," he said, and his voice dropped slightly. "Not to be kind, but to be private, which in a quiet room has the opposite effect. I'm sure you're very capable at what you do here, but this is a client-facing event. I have partners attending, investors. These are people who notice things, and I need to be confident in who's representing the service." He let that sit for a moment. "Is there someone else here I could work with on this?" I have thought about that moment many times since. What it cost to stay still. What it would have been easier to do. Deflect, redirect, call for someone else, not because there was someone more qualified, but simply to relieve the pressure of the moment. I have done that before, in younger versions of myself. Smoothed things over, made space, disappeared slightly so that the air in the room could settle. I didn't do that this time. "There isn't," I said. "I'm the person who handles this. I'm also the person who's been running this operation for over a decade, who has a culinary certification, a food service management license, and a client list I'm happy to verify." I kept my voice level. Not defensive, not performative, just clear. "If you'd like to move forward, I'm glad to help you put together something your guests will remember. If you'd prefer to find another vendor, I completely understand. But I want to make sure you have accurate information before you make that call." The silence that followed was brief, maybe 3 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that feels longer because everyone in it is aware of it. Harkirat Sehgal looked at me, really looked, maybe for the first time since he'd walked through the door. I held that gaze without filling it with anything extra, without offering him an easier version of the moment than the one we were already in. Then, something moved across his face. I couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't shame. Men like him rarely arrive at shame quickly. It was something closer to the dawning recognition that the situation was not arranged the way he had assumed. "Fine," he said. "Send me the proposal." He picked up his coffee cup. He'd brought it back, apparently for a refill, though he hadn't mentioned that, and he stood there waiting while I refilled it, and then he went back to his table without another word. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Behind me, Jess made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. I turned around, and she was looking at me with an expression I didn't know how to interpret. Somewhere between admiration and something more tender. The way you look at someone when you've just watched them carry something heavy and not drop it. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. But something had shifted in me. Some quiet arrangement of things I had long kept carefully in place. Because I had told the truth, I was okay. And I was also, somewhere beneath the okay, beginning to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the anger. Not yet. Something more precise than anger. I pulled out my notebook. I still use a paper notebook, which the younger staff find both charming and baffling, and I began writing down the details for the proposal. 30 guests. Saturday, 7 o'clock. I wrote down Harkirat Segal's name, and then I paused, pen against paper, because something was pulling at the edge of my memory. Something about that name, that firm, that building 2 blocks north. I wrote one more word in the corner of the page, underlined it, and looked at it for a moment. Then I went back to work. I found it that afternoon, during the 30 minutes I take for lunch, which in practice means eating a sandwich standing near the back counter while checking emails and signing off on the week's supply order. Not glamorous, but mine. I had been turning that name over in my mind all morning. Harkirat Segal, the firm, the building to the north. There was something specific I was reaching for. Not a feeling, but a fact, the kind that sits just below the surface of memory and resists being pulled up directly. You have to come at it sideways. I opened my laptop and typed his name into the search bar. The results were immediate and plentiful. He was exactly what the suit and the watch suggested. A senior partner at a development firm with projects across 3 states, a board seat at a cultural foundation, a profile in a regional business publication from 2 years ago. The article had a photograph of him in front of one of his buildings, smiling in a way that suggested the photographer had asked him to look approachable and he had done his best. I scrolled past the professional biography, past the project announcements, past the charity gala photographs where he appeared in the background of images featuring people who were slightly more famous than he was. And then I found it. It was a community board meeting record publicly posted on the city's website 14 months ago. A hearing about a zoning variance for a proposed mixed-use development, the same building I had been thinking about, the one that replaced the pharmacy and the laundromat. Public comments had been submitted. Residents had spoken. Several small business owners had appeared before the board to express concern about displacement, rising rents, the erosion of the block's character. One of those business owners had submitted a written statement. I read the statement twice. It was careful and detailed and written in the formal language of someone who had prepared it with help, who understood that they were operating in a process that didn't naturally favor them and had done their best to speak its language. It described 17 years of operation. It described a client base that included elderly residents who walked to the pharmacy because they had no other way to get there. It described a family, a husband, a wife, a daughter who had grown up in the back of that store doing her homework at a folding table while her parents worked. At the bottom of the statement was a name. I closed the laptop slowly. I sat for a moment with my sandwich untouched and thought about the specific geometry of the world, which is sometimes so precise it feels almost intentional. The name at the bottom of that statement was Tarangini Vashisht, the owner of the pharmacy that no longer existed, whose family had packed their things into a moving truck on a Wednesday afternoon while their customers stood on the sidewalk. Tarangini Vashisht, who had written a careful statement in formal language and presented it to a board that had ultimately approved the variance anyway. Tarangini Vashisht, who was my mother's closest friend for 23 years. I had gone to her daughter's birthday parties as a child. I had eaten the food her husband made on Sunday afternoons when our families visited. I had stood outside that pharmacy on that Wednesday and helped carry boxes to the truck while my mother cried in the car because she didn't want anyone to see her cry. I had not known, until this moment, the name of the developer who had built the building that replaced it. I picked up my sandwich. I ate it. I finished the supply order. I signed the forms. Then I opened a new document and began writing the catering proposal for Harkirat Segal's event. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I did not decide in that moment to do anything other than my job. I am not telling you this story because it ends with revenge, or sabotage, or any of the satisfying dramatic mechanisms that make people want to share things online. I'm telling you this story because of what actually happened, which is both smaller and larger than any of that. I wrote the proposal. It was thorough. It was professional. It detailed the menu options, the staffing plan, the setup and breakdown timeline, the pricing, which was fair, neither inflated out of resentment nor discounted out of some misguided desire to prove something. I attached 3 references, including a letter from the managing partner of a law firm downtown who had used our catering service 4 times and written, unprompted, that it was the best organized event service he had worked with. I sent it at 4:47 in the afternoon. At 5:23, I received a reply. Looks comprehensive. Let's move forward. Can you come by the office Thursday to finalize details? No apology for the morning. No acknowledgement of what had passed between us at the counter. A clean slate, offered without ceremony, which is its own kind of statement about how certain people move through interactions they'd rather not examine too closely. I replied that Thursday worked. I gave a time. I kept it brief. That evening, after I had closed up and set the chairs and turned off the lights, I called my mother. We talk every few days. She's 71 now, still sharp, still the kind of person who notices everything and says exactly half of what she's thinking. I told her I'd been looking into something and had come across the name of Tarangini's old pharmacy. There was a pause. Why? She asked. Something came up at work, I said. Connected. Another pause. My mother has a gift for pauses. They do more work than most people's sentences. Tarangini is doing all right, she said finally. She and her husband opened a small place in Edison. Nothing like before, but they're managing. That's good, I said. Why did you really call? My mother asked. This is the other thing about my mother. She has never once accepted a deflection from me. I told her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. I described the man, the morning, the business card, the search. I described finding the community board records and Tarangini's statement and the weight of that coincidence, if it was a coincidence. My mother listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? She said. My job, I said. She made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something more complicated. With my mother, those two things are not always distinct. Your father would say something wise right now, she said. I forget sometimes what it would be. My father had been gone for 6 years. The heart attack that had brought me home from my graduate program had eventually been followed, years later, by a second one that didn't let go. He was a man of few words and great precision, who believed that most situations resolved themselves if you simply refused to be diminished by them. I think I know what he'd say, I said. Good, said my mother. Then you don't need me to say it. I laughed, a small, real laugh, the kind that only happens when you're tired and something catches you off guard with its accuracy. I went home. I made dinner. I went through the catering plan once more before bed, checking quantities, confirming suppliers, thinking through the staffing for Saturday. I fell asleep without difficulty, which surprised me. I thought the day would sit heavier than that, but something had moved into alignment inside me. Not peace, exactly. Something more like readiness. The feeling of a person who has looked clearly at a situation and decided, without drama, what she is going to do. Thursday came. I took the elevator to the 14th floor of a glass building 2 blocks north of my coffee shop, carrying a printed copy of the proposal in a folder, wearing the same kind of careful, understated clothing I wear when I represent the business in any formal context. I had done my hair. I had my notes. The receptionist led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that costs money, even when you're just looking at it. Harkirat Sehgal came in 3 minutes later, still in his suit, still with the unhurried posture. He shook my hand. His grip was firm in the automatic way of someone who has attended a seminar about handshakes. He gestured to the chair across from his. I sat down. And then, I don't know what moved me, whether it was my father's voice in some form, or my mother's pauses, or Tarangini's careful formal language in a document that had ultimately changed nothing. I opened the folder, set the proposal on the table, and said very calmly, "Before we go through the details, there's something I'd like to say." He looked up. He looked up from the proposal with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being preceded by someone else's agenda. There was a brief recalibration behind his eyes. Not alarm, not quite, but the slight adjustment of someone who had expected a particular kind of meeting and was now being informed, quietly, that it might be a different one. "Of course," he said. I had rehearsed this moment in my head a dozen times since Thursday morning. On the walk over, I had rehearsed it twice more. And now that I was here, sitting across from him in a conference room that smelled like new carpet and recycled air, I realized the rehearsed version wasn't quite right. Too formal, too constructed. What I needed was simply to speak clearly, the way my mother had always spoken to people who underestimated her, without performance, without apology, without the slightly raised voice that signals you're asking permission to be taken seriously. "Yesterday morning," I said, "when you came into the shop, you asked several times whether there was someone else who could help you, someone more experienced, someone better suited to your event." He didn't interrupt. I'll give him that. "I want you to know I'm not bringing this up to make the next few minutes uncomfortable. I'm bringing it up because I think it's worth naming, and because I'd rather we work from an honest foundation if we're going to work together at all." A pause. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent business. "You're right," he said. "I hadn't expected that. Not so quickly, not without qualification. The way I handled that was off," he said. He looked down at the proposal on the table between us, then back at me. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. That's on me." I studied his face. I have spent 11 years reading people across counters and tables, learning the difference between the apology that wants something and the apology that is simply trying to put something right. His was somewhere between the two, genuine enough to be real, but also the apology of a man who is practical, who had seen the proposal and the references and understood that he had nearly dismissed competence because of his own reflex. "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it precisely to the degree it was true, which was partial. Acknowledgement is not the same as repair, but it is a beginning, and I have learned, slowly, over years of situations that asked me to decide what I could work with, that beginnings matter. "There's something else," I said. He waited. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I'm not telling you to put you at a disadvantage or to create any kind of pressure around this event. I'm telling you because I think you should know, and because not telling you would feel dishonest." I watched his posture shift, almost imperceptibly. "When I looked up your firm after our conversation yesterday, I found the records from the zoning hearing 14 months ago, the development on Cortlandt Street." He was very still now. "The family that owned the pharmacy that closed, the Vashischts, Tarangini Vashisht, is my mother's closest friend. I helped them move their things out of that building. I was there that day." The silence in the room changed quality. It became the kind of silence you can feel against your skin. Harkirat Segal looked at me for a long moment. Something was happening behind his eyes that I couldn't fully interpret. Not guilt exactly, but something being confronted that usually lived in a part of his mind he didn't visit often. The comfortable distance between a business decision and its human consequence had just collapsed into the length of a conference table. "I didn't know that," he said. His voice was quieter. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's partly why I'm telling you. I have thought about this moment many times since, about what I was doing and why, about whether it was the right thing, about what I hoped it would accomplish. I didn't tell him to punish him. I didn't tell him to watch him squirm or to demonstrate some kind of moral authority. I told him because I genuinely believe that people cannot make better choices if they never have to look at the full shape of the ones they've already made. And I believe that because I have had to look at my own." We sat in that reconfigured silence for what felt like a long time, but was probably 20 seconds. Then Harkirat Segal said something I did not expect. "How are they doing?" I looked at him. "The family," he said. "How are they doing?" "They opened a smaller place in Edison," I said. "They're managing." He nodded slowly. He picked up the proposal, set it down again without looking at it. "That hearing," he said. "I didn't attend it personally. My team handled the process. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. I'm just saying I've never had to sit across from someone connected to it before. Most people don't," I said. "That's part of how it works." Another silence, shorter this time. "Are you still willing to take this event?" he asked. Yes, I said. That's why I'm here. He exhaled, a real exhale, the kind that moves through the chest. Okay, he said. Then let's go through the proposal. We spent the next hour doing exactly that. He asked good questions. He deferred to my expertise without making a production of doing so. We negotiated one item on the pricing, a detail about staffing hours, and reached an agreement that was fair to both sides. He signed the contract at the end of the meeting. When I stood to leave, he stood too, and this time the handshake was different. Not in the mechanical way of a seminar, something more considered in it. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why did you take the meeting? After yesterday. You could have sent the proposal and declined when I asked you to come in. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about my father, who drove a taxi at night and went to school in the morning and never stopped believing that the quality of your work was something nobody could take from you. I thought about my mother, who came to this country with $80 and had raised someone who knew how to walk into a glass building and tell the truth to someone who didn't expect it. Because this is my business, I said, and because I don't make decisions about what I'm willing to do based on how someone treated me before they knew who I was. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. I think he understood that there was nothing to add. The event was on Saturday. I arrived 2 hours early with my team, 2 part-time staff I had worked with for years and trusted completely. We set up with the efficiency of people who have done this enough times that it looks effortless, which is the only kind of effortless worth having. The food was excellent. The coffee service was flawless. The guests moved through the space with the relaxed pleasure of people who are being well taken care of and know it. At one point during the evening, Harkirat Segal crossed the room toward me. I was standing near the service table, overseeing the replenishment of a platter. My partner just asked who organized this, he said. I told him your name. Thank you, I said. He wants a card. I gave him one. 3 weeks later, his partner's firm hired us for their annual client reception. 220 guests. Our largest event to date. I'm telling you this not because the story ends with a number, with proof that competence wins if you just hold on long enough. That's too simple, and real life doesn't trade in simple. I'm telling you because of what I understood, somewhere between that first morning and that Saturday evening, about what it actually means to refuse to be diminished. It doesn't mean you win every room. It doesn't mean every Harkirat Segal recalibrates and signs a contract and sends business your way. Sometimes they just leave with their coffee and their assumptions intact, and you go back to training your new hire and restocking cups. But it means something happened inside you that nobody can undo. A door that was never closed because you never let it be closed in the first place. A story you get to carry differently, not as the person who was looked past, but as the person who stood in place and made someone look again. My mother called me the night of the event. I was in the car, still in my work clothes, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a thing done well. How did it go? She asked. Really well, I said. Good, she said. And then, after one of her precise, carefully weighted pauses, your father would have said nothing. He just would have smiled. I drove home through the city. The buildings passed. Somewhere up on the 14th floor of one of them, a party was winding down in a room where my name had been given to a stranger as a recommendation. I thought about Taranggini in her smaller place in Edison, her husband in the kitchen, her daughter grown now and probably doing homework somewhere else. At a different folding table, I thought about what it costs to build something, and what it costs to keep building after someone has told you, without words, that they don't believe you can. And I thought about the fact that I had gone to work the next morning anyway, and the morning after that, and all the mornings since, before sunrise, when the sky is still that deep bruised blue, and the city is quiet, and I pull up the shutters, and the smell of espresso grounds is already on my hands, not because it was easy, because it was mine.